They say the devil walks loudest through a town gone quiet. The rope burns were still red when they threw her out. Not with ceremony, not with trial. Just 3 men at dawn, dragging Sarah Bridger by her torn shawl through the mud of Cinder Flats, past the mercantile where she'd once bought sugar for her mother's pies, past the church steps where she'd been baptized at 7, past faces she'd known her whole life, faces that turned away like shutters slamming shut against a storm. "Witch," someone whispered. "Liar," said another. "Worse," hissed Mrs. Calloway, the minister's wife, clutching her Bible so tight her knuckles went bone white. Sarah didn't fight. Fighting makes them feel righteous. She'd learned that from her mother, who'd been dragged just the same 12 years prior, accused of poisoning a man who'd tried to force himself on her in a barn. They'd hanged her from the cottonwood. Sarah had watched from behind a water trough, 9 years old, mouth stuffed with her own fist to keep from screaming. Now she was 21, old enough to know that justice wasn't a thing that lived in courtrooms. It lived wherever men with loud voices decided it did. The charge this time, consorting with the enemy. A Cheyenne man had been seen near her cabin. Once, twice, 3 times, they said, though Sarah had only spoken to him once, given him water from her well when he'd stumbled past with a bullet wound in his shoulder, fevered and shaking. She'd bandaged him with strips from her own skirt. He'd been gone by morning. But that was enough. In Cinder Flats, mercy toward an Indian was the same as treason. And treason, for a woman alone, was the same as witchcraft, adultery, and rebellion, all bound together with a noose. They didn't hang her. That would have required a trial. Instead, they stripped her of her land deed, burned her cabin to the ground, and carved a mark into her, a brand on her left forearm, just below the elbow, the shape of a broken cross. "So every town knows what you are," Sheriff Gann had said, pressing the hot iron into her skin while 2 men held her down on the jailhouse floor. She'd bitten through her lip. Blood ran down her chin, copper and salt, but she hadn't screamed. Wouldn't give them that. They'd shoved her out the town gate at first light, with nothing but the dress on her back and a canteen half full of water. No horse, no coin, no name left to her but the one they'd spit at her. Outcast, the October wind cut like a knife made of ice. Sarah walked north because north was away. Her boots, cracked leather, too thin for winter, crunched over frost-hard ground. Her breath came out in clouds. Blood from the brand had soaked through the rag she'd tied around her arm, and every step sent fire up into her shoulder. She didn't cry. Tears freeze on your face out here, and that's just another kind of pain. By midday, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. Snow began to fall, not the soft kind, but small and sharp, like shards of glass spinning in the wind. Her legs gave out near sunset. She fell to her knees in the middle of a dry creek bed, hands sinking into frozen mud. The world swayed. She tasted blood again, but this time it was from the cold cracking her lips open. This is how it ends, she thought, alone, frozen, forgotten. But then a shape on the horizon, a building, small, tilted, half buried in prairie grass gone gold with death, a schoolhouse. Section 2. The Stranger at the Door. A man who's seen death knows the sound of dying. Sarah didn't move. Her fingers curled against the floorboards, nails digging into the wood grain. The voice outside came again, softer this time, like he was talking to a spooked horse. "I ain't here to hurt you. Saw your tracks in the snow. Figured someone was in trouble. She forced herself upright, back pressed against the wall, good arm wrapped around her ribs. Her vision swam. The brand burned like it was fresh. Through the gap in the warped door, she could see him, a tall figure, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. A horse stood behind him, gray as smoke, breathing fog into the frozen air. "I got nothing worth taking," Sarah said. Her voice came out hoarse, cracked from cold and thirst. "Didn't ask if you did." Silence. The wind pushed snow through the doorway, in small drifts. Sarah watched his shadow, waiting for him to force his way in, waiting for hands that would grab and hurt. That's what men did. That's what she'd learned. But he didn't move. "You hurt?" he asked. She didn't answer. "You branded?" Her breath caught. How did he know? She looked down at her arm, at the blood-soaked rag. The broken cross had bled through the cloth, dark and unmistakable. "Cinder Flats?" he asked. "You a bounty man?" "No, ma'am." "Then what do you want?" A long pause. The horse nickered softly. She heard the man shift his weight, boot leather creaking. When he spoke again, his voice carried something she didn't expect. Weariness. Not threat. Just tired. "To give you this?" He set something down just outside the door, then stepped back. Sarah waited, counting her heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. When she was sure he'd moved away, she crawled forward and pulled the door open just enough to see. A bedroll, a canteen, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She looked up. The man stood 10 paces back, hands loose at his sides, no gun drawn. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 40, maybe older, with a face carved hard by wind and sun. A scar ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline. His coat was patched at the elbows, a widower's coat, mended by his own hands. "There's jerky and hardtack in the cloth," he said. "Canteen's full. Bedroll's clean." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. Snow gathered on the brim of his hat. "Because I got a daughter about your age. And if she was alone and freezing, I'd hope someone would do the same." "Where is she?" "Dead. Cholera. 3 years back." Sarah's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if there was anything to say. The man tipped his hat. "Name's Caleb Rust. I got a place about 6 miles west. Ain't much, but it's got a stove and a roof. You're welcome to it till the snow clears. I don't need charity." "Didn't offer charity. Offered a roof." He turned toward his horse, then stopped. "That brand on your arm. They'll hunt you if you stay near towns. But out here, no one cares what you've been called. Only what you do." He mounted his horse and rode into the gray, swallowed by snow and distance. Sarah stared at the bedroll, at the canteen, at the fading hoof prints. And for the first time in days, she let herself believe she might live through the night. Section 3. The Widower's Fire. Trust is a thing you earn in silence, one kindness at a time. Sarah stayed in the schoolhouse for 2 days, wrapped in Caleb Rust's bedroll, eating his jerky in small bites to make it last. The snow fell heavy and constant, burying the prairie under white. She watched the world disappear through the gaps in the wall and thought about dying clean, freezing instead of starving, white instead of mud. On the 3rd morning, the snow stopped. The sun broke through like a knife cutting canvas, bright and cold. Sarah stood in the doorway, squinting at the light. Her arm still throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped. She'd cleaned the brand with snow, wrapped it fresh with a strip torn from her petticoat. It would scar. It would always scar. She looked west. 6 miles, he'd said. She didn't owe him anything, didn't know him. But the jerky was gone, the canteen nearly empty, and the cold would come back when the sun set. She could die here alone, or she could walk toward the only hand that had reached for her in mercy. Sarah rolled up the bedroll, slung it over her shoulder, and started walking. The Caleb Russ place wasn't a ranch. It was a cabin, small and low, built from rough-cut timber and chinked with mud. Smoke rose thin and gray from a stone chimney. A lean-to stood beside it, sheltering a plow horse and Caleb's gray. Firewood was stacked neat against the north wall. A chicken coop sat empty, door hanging crooked. Sarah stopped at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. The door opened. Caleb stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw her and nodded, like he'd been expecting her all along. "Figured you'd come, or you wouldn't," he said. "Glad you did." He didn't smile, didn't make a show of welcome. Just stepped aside and held the door open. Inside, the cabin was warm. An iron stove burned low in the corner, heat rolling off it in waves. The room was small. 1 table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed shoved against the far wall. Shelves held tin plates, a coffee pot, a few jars of preserves. Everything was clean. Everything had a place. "You can sleep there," Caleb said, nodding toward the bed. "I'll take the floor." "I can take the floor." "You're hurt. Bed's yours." Sarah set the bedroll down carefully, like it might break. Her fingers were numb, clumsy. Caleb poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. She wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat sink into her bones. "You eat yet today?" he asked. She shook her head. He set a bowl of stew in front of her, rabbit, potatoes, wild onion. The smell alone made her stomach clench. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp, not to show how hollow she was inside. Caleb sat across from her, drinking his coffee, saying nothing. The silence wasn't heavy. It was just there, like the wood smoke, like the warmth. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Why'd you help me?" Caleb stared into his cup. "I told you, my daughter—" "No, the real reason." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were the color of old iron. "I was a soldier once," he said. "Did things I can't take back. Burned villages. Killed men who were just protecting their families. I came home, and my wife looked at me like I was something broken. Maybe I was." He set his cup down. "She died hating me. My daughter died thinking I was a monster, and maybe they were right. But out here, I figured, maybe I could do one thing that wasn't burning, one thing that wasn't killing." Sarah looked at him, really looked. At the scar on his face, at the calluses on his hands, at the way he sat like a man carrying weight no one else could see. "I ain't your salvation," she said quietly. "No, ma'am, but maybe you're still alive, and maybe that's enough." Defiance don't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the world still hears. Sarah stayed through winter, not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was true, but because Caleb Russ didn't ask her to leave, and she didn't know how to walk away from the first place that felt like mercy instead of judgment. She learned his rhythms. He rose before dawn, fed the horses, chopped wood. She mended his clothes, cooked what little they had, kept the cabin clean. They didn't talk much. Words weren't currency here. Work was, silence was. But one night in January, after a meal of cornbread and beans, Caleb pulled something from his coat pocket and set it on the table between them. A smooth river stone, pale gray, flat on one side. "Found this by the creek," he said. "Thought you might want it." Sarah picked it up. It was cold, heavy, worn smooth by water and time. "What for?" "For the brand," Caleb said. "You carry shame that ain't yours. Figured maybe you could carry something else instead. Something you choose." She turned the stone over in her palm. Her throat tightened. "It's just a rock. So's a gravestone. Still means something." Sarah closed her fingers around it. That night, she carved a single word into its surface with the tip of a nail. Survived. She kept it in her pocket after that, a weight that was hers. Spring came slow and cold. The snow melted into mud, and the prairie turned green. Sarah's arm healed, the brand settling into a puckered scar. She stopped covering it, let it show. If people wanted to call her marked, let them. She knew what she was. In April, Caleb rode into the nearest settlement, a crossroads town called Ashford, to trade furs for flour and salt. Sarah stayed behind. She didn't go near towns anymore. He came back 3 hours later, face dark as a thunderhead. "They're looking for you," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Sheriff from Cinder Flats put a notice out. Says you stole from the church before you left. Says there's a reward." Sarah's stomach dropped. "I didn't steal anything." "Don't matter. They're saying it now." He tied the horse to the post, jaw tight. "There's a man in Ashford asking questions. Tall, pale-eyed. Said he's a marshal, but I don't believe it. Moves like a hired gun." "Then I'll leave," Sarah said. "I won't bring trouble on you." "You ain't bringing nothing I didn't invite." Caleb looked at her hard. "But we need a plan. If he comes here, he won't come alone." And the man hanged 2 days later. Sarah was in the lean-to, brushing down the plow horse, when she heard hoofbeats. 3 riders. She moved to the doorway, heart pounding, and saw them. 2 men in dusters, guns on their hips, and a third in a black hat, pale-eyed and thin-lipped. Caleb stepped out of the cabin, rifle in hand but not raised. "Help you, gentlemen?" he asked. The pale-eyed man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for a woman. Branded, red hair. Goes by Sarah Bridger." "Don't know her." "Heard she might have passed through. Heard you got a soft spot for strays." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "I got a soft spot for minding my own business. Suggest you do the same." The man's smile faded. "We can do this easy or hard, old man." And then a sound, small, high, clear. A child's voice coming from the road behind them. "She ain't done nothing wrong." Everyone turned. A boy stood there, maybe 8 years old, barefoot and dusty, holding a fishing pole. He was from one of the scattered homesteads. Sarah had seen him once before, fishing the creek. "You know her, boy?" The pale-eyed man asked. "Know she gave me bread when I was hungry. Know she helped my ma birth my sister when the midwife wouldn't come. Know she ain't no thief." The boy looked straight at the man, unflinching. "And I know you ain't no marshal. My pa says real lawmen don't ride with bounty killers." Silence. The wind moved through the grass. The pale-eyed man stared at the boy, then at Caleb, then past him toward the cabin where Sarah stood in the shadows of the doorway. He spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." He wheeled his horse and rode off, the other 2 following. The boy watched them go, then looked at Sarah. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and walked back toward the creek. Sarah stepped out into the sunlight, hand tight around the stone in her pocket. Caleb lowered his rifle. "That boy just saved your life." "No," Sarah said quietly. "He just said the truth. Sometimes that's enough. Survival ain't always loud. Sometimes it's just waking up and choosing to plant seeds." Summer came hard and dry. The prairie grass turned gold, then brown. Sarah and Caleb worked the land together, plowing a small garden plot behind the cabin, planting beans and squash and wild onion bulbs she'd dug from the creek bank. Her hands blistered, then calloused. The scar on her arm darkened in the sun, a permanent mark she no longer tried to hide. The pale-eyed man never came back, but word spread different now. The boy's father told someone, who told someone else, who told another. Stories have a way of traveling faster than horses. By midsummer, when Sarah went with Caleb to Ashford for supplies, people didn't turn away. They didn't smile either, but they didn't spit. An old woman at the mercantile nodded to her. A farmer tipped his hat. Small things, but small things add up. One evening in late August, Sarah stood in the garden pulling weeds, dirt under her fingernails, sweat on her brow. The sun hung low and orange, painting everything gold. Caleb came out of the cabin and stood watching her, arms crossed. "You planning to stay?" he asked. Sarah straightened, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "You asking me to?" "I'm asking what you want." She looked at the garden, at the beans climbing their poles, at the cabin with smoke rising lazy from the chimney, at the stone she'd set by the doorway, the word "survived" facing out where anyone could see it. "I want to stay," she said, "if you'll have me." Caleb nodded. "Then stay." October came around again. 1 year since she'd been cast out. Sarah woke before dawn and walked to the creek where she'd first seen the schoolhouse in the distance. The building was still there, leaning and empty, half swallowed by grass. She knelt at the water's edge and pulled the branded arm free of her sleeve. The broken cross stared back at her, raised and purple against her skin. She touched it carefully, tracing the lines. They'd meant it as shame, as a warning, as a way to mark her as less than human. But she was still here. She pulled the river stone from her pocket, the one Caleb had given her, and pressed it against the scar. Cool and smooth. A reminder that she'd chosen to carry something besides their judgment. "I survived you," she whispered to the scar, to the men who'd made it, to the town that had cast her out. "And I'll keep surviving." She set the stone carefully at the creek's edge, half buried in mud and pebbles. A marker, a witness. Then she walked back toward the cabin, toward the garden, toward the life she was building one day at a time. Winter came again, but this time Sarah was ready. The cabin was stocked. The firewood was cut and stacked. The garden had yielded enough to last them through the cold months. She and Caleb sat by the stove one evening in December, mending harnesses in comfortable silence, when he spoke. "You ever think about going back? To Cinder Flats?" "No," Sarah said without hesitation. "That place is dead to me." "Good." Caleb tied off a knot and tested the leather's strength. "Because you're more alive now than you ever were there." Sarah looked at him. This broken man who'd reached out his hand when everyone else had turned away. This stranger who'd become something like family. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me, when no one else would." Caleb nodded once, slow and certain. "We see each other. That's how we survive." Years passed. The garden grew. The scar faded to white, but never disappeared. Sarah never went back to Cinder Flats, But she didn't hide either. She walked into Ashford with her head up, the brand visible on her arm. Some people still whispered, some still judged, but others, more and more, nodded in respect. The boy who'd spoken up grew into a young man and brought his own wife to meet her. The old woman at the mercantile saved her the best cuts of fabric. A traveling preacher asked her to help tend to a sick family, and she did, because mercy was something she understood now, in ways she hadn't before. She kept the stone by the cabin door. Survived, carved deep and permanent. Not triumph, not revenge. Just the simple, stubborn truth of still being here, still breathing, still planting seeds each spring and harvesting them each fall. Caleb Russ died in his sleep one winter, 10 years after he'd found her. Sarah buried him on the hill, overlooking the cabin, and marked his grave with stones from the creek. She stayed in the cabin, kept the garden, lived quiet and strong. And when people asked her story, and some did, eventually, she'd show them the scar and the stone and the garden. "I was marked for shame," she'd say, "but I chose to mark myself for survival instead, and that made all the difference." They say the devil walks loudest through a town gone quiet, but they also say that mercy whispers, and the brave still hear it. Which voice will you listen for?